Hello, welcome to Biology, the scientific study of life. Phylogenetic systematics connect classification with evolutionary history. The discipline of systematics dates to the 18th century. In 1748, Swedish botanists and anatomists Carl Linnaeus published Systema Natura or Natura, system of nature, which means his taxonomic classification of all plants and animals known at that time. Taxonomy is an ordered division of organisms into categories based on a set of characteristics used to assess similarities and differences, although Linnaeus' classification was not based on evolutionary relationships but simply on resemblances. Many features of his system remain useful in phylogenetic systematics. Two of these are binomial designations for species and hierarchical classification. Binomial nomenclature. Common names of organisms such as monkey, finch, and lilac convey meaning in casual usage, but they can also cause confusion. Each of these names, for example, refers to more than one species. Moreover, some common names do not accurately reflect the type of organisms. Consider these three fishes: jellyfish, anidarian, crayfish, a small lobster like crustacean, and silverfish, an insect. And of course, different languages have different words of various organisms. To avoid ambiguity when communicating about organisms, biologists refer to each species by a scientific name. The two-part format of the scientific name, called a binomial, was instituted by Linnaeus. The first part of a species name is the genus, plural genera, to which the species belongs. The second part is the specific epithet, which is unique for each species, the genus. An example of a binomial is Panthera pardus, the scientific name for the large cat commonly called the leopard. Notice that the first letter of the genus is capitalized and the entire binomial is italicized. Scientific names are also Latinized. You can name an insect you discover after a friend, but you must add an appropriate Latin ending. Many of the more than 100,000 or 11,000 binomials assigned by Linnaeus are still used today, including the optimistic name he designated for our own species, Homo sapiens, meaning wise man. Hierarchical classification. In addition to naming species, Linnaeus also grouped them into a hierarchy of increasingly broad categories. The first grouping is built into a binomial. Species that appear to be closely related are grouped into the same genus. For example, the leopard Panthera pardus belongs to a genus that also includes the African lions, Panthera la, the tiger Panthera tigris, and the jaguar Panthera onca. Beyond genera, systematists employ progressively more comprehensive categories of classification. They place related genera in the same family group, families into orders, orders into classes, classes into phyla, singular phylum, phyla into kingdoms, and more recently kingdoms into domains. The name taxonomic unit at any level is called a taxon, plural taxa. For example, Panthera is a taxon at the genus level, and mammal is a taxon at the class level that includes all the many orders of mammals. Note that taxa broader than the genus level are not italicized, though they are capitalized. The resulting biological classification of a particular organism is somewhat like a postal address identifying a person in a particular apartment, in a building with many apartments, on a street with many apartment buildings, in a city with many streets, in a state with many cities, and so on. Classifying species seems to come naturally to humans. It is also it's a way to structure our views of the world. We lump together several species of a tree to which we give the common name of oaks and distinguish them from other species of trees we call chestnuts. Taxonomists have decided that oaks and chestnuts are different enough that they should belong to separate genera. Yet oaks and chestnuts are deemed similar enough to be grouped into the same family. The Fagisa, this decision was ultimately arbitrary because higher classification levels are generally defined by various morphological characters chosen by taxonomists rather than by some quantitative measurements applicable to all organisms. For this reason, the larger categories are often not comparable between lengths. That is, an order of snails does not necessarily exhibit the same degree of morphological or genetic diversity as an order of mammals. Linking classification and phylogeny. We saw earlier how systematists explore phylogeny by examining various characteristics in living and fossil organisms. They use branching diagrams called phylogenetic trees to depict their hypotheses about evolutionary relationships. The branching of such trees reflects the hierarchical classification of groupings nested within more inclusive groups. Notice this one, et voila. A phylogenetic tree is often constructed from a series of dichotomies or two-way branch points. Each branch point represents the divergence of two species from a common ancestor. For example, we call it represent a branch point within the cat family this way. Leopard and domestic cat, notice that, bon, common ancestor. We can also diagram dichotomous branching of taxa that are more inclusive than species such as families, and order each of the deeper branch points represents progressively greater amounts of divergence. Notice that wolf, leopard, domestic cat, and common ancestor. Do not confuse the sequence of branching in a tree with the vintages, actual ages of the particular species. The tree in this figure does not indicate that the wolf evolved more recently than the European otter, but only that their common ancestor preceded the last common ancestor of the wolf and the domestic dog. Methods for tracing phylogeny began with Darwin, who, unlike Linnaeus, released the evolutionary implications of hierarchical classification. Darwin introduced phylogenetics systematics in the origin of species, writing, "Our classifications will come to be, as far as they can be so made, genealogies." Phylogenetic systematics informs the construction of phylogenetic trees based on shared characters. Patterns of shared characteristics can be depicted in a diagram called a cladogram. A cladogram by itself does not imply evolutionary history, but if the shared characteristics are due to common ancestry, that is, if they are homologous, then the cladogram forms the basis of phylogenetic tree. Within the tree, a clade, from the Greek klados, branch, is defined as a group of species that includes an ancestor species and all its descendants. The analysis of how species may be grouped into clades is called codistics. Codistics clades like taxonomic ranks can be nested within larger clades. For example, the cat family represents a clade within a larger clade that also includes the dog family. But not all groupings of organisms qualify as clades. A valid clade is monophyletic, meaning single tribe, signifying that it consists of ancestral species and all its descendants. When we lack information about some members of a clade, the result is a paraphyletic grouping which consists of an ancestor species and some, but not all, of the descendants, or the result may be a polyphyletic grouping of several species that lack a common ancestor. Such situations call for further restrictions to uncover species that tie together this grouping into a monophyletic clades.